Mr. President, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me.
We're very, very glad that you want to be with us on Belgian television. And since you visited our country twice, I think, what are your recollections of the small country that we are?
Well, other than, this is very stereotypical, but other than the chocolates and the pastries and the waffles, which I confess I had probably more than my share of, it was so important for me to see where so much work takes place with the European Union, because obviously European unification is one of the seminal achievements, I think, of the 20th century. Obviously, it's been under strain and there's controversy, but it still remains the linchpin of a peaceful, prosperous Europe. And that's what brought me to work in Belgium on several occasions, to Brussels on several occasions. And also the memory of my visit to Flanders Field with King Philip and then Prime Minister Di Rupo, a reminder of the transatlantic relationship, and that the peace and progress that we've made has been as a consequence of the sacrifices that were made by both Americans and Europeans, and that we have to be true to that legacy and that tradition.
To that legacy, of course. We're here to talk about your book, of course, which in itself is a legacy, I must say, 860 pages. I must say I enjoyed reading it. It's a very good book, Mr. President. You start the book with your first days, obviously, and immediately the question came to mind, what was more easy for you? Your first night in the White House 12 years ago, or your last night in the White House 4 years ago?
I think the first night in the White House was easier than the last few weeks of my stay in the White House. Obviously, there was enormous crisis that was taking place when I came into the White House, and you feel the weight of, at that time, a major global economic crisis. We still had two wars taking place, and to know that you are now, in Harry Truman's phrase, the buck stops with you. You are the final decision maker. That is a profound experience. On the back end, when I was leaving, I think the whole White House, my administration, was very proud of what we had achieved over 8 years. My approval ratings were still very high, and so to see somebody who was, as I said in the book, diametrically opposed to everything I stood for, now taking my place was disheartening.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in a moment, of course. But since you're talking about the polls, in your first year, I recall you started with an approval rate of 67 points. And after Obamacare, it dropped to 45. Well, at the time that you gave the American public a decent healthcare system. To us in Europe, to the Europeans, that was really astonishing.
Well, keep in mind that the financial crisis that I inherited was different than the one that we're going through right now. Right now, we're going through what's similar to a natural disaster. So everything has dropped in terms of productivity and employment, but you don't have a systemic problem. As soon as, if and when we can get over this pandemic, the economy, I think, will surge very quickly. Financial crises are different. There was huge debt overhang. Consumers and companies had participated in the housing bubble and the market bubble, and so it took several years just to get back to where we were. And people were in a bad mood as a result. And even though we responded effectively, it still took time. And in the midst of this, trying to then do a major social program like healthcare, I think it was something that people weren't sure whether this would work or not. Austerity politics was still dominant in the United States as it was in Europe. And so there was concern, this is now not the time to spend money. The good news is that today, approval for our healthcare initiative is very high. I wish it had happened about 4 years earlier. But you know, it's a reminder, and I try to describe in the book, that sometimes very good policy is not good politics at any single moment. And part of the job of any political leader is to be able to make judgments about when do you have to take public opinion into account, and when do you have to go ahead and move forward in a
do the right thing,
in principled way, and try to do the right thing, even though you know you're going to pay a political cost for it.
Yeah. I want to come back to the preface of your book, where you write a very peculiar sentence. You say, "I'm not ready to abandon the idea of America." So first of all, to our viewers, what is in your mind that idea of America? That's very abstract, but and not ready to abandon it means that you're close to abandon it.
Well, I think I was writing in the context, as I described, that you know, when you look at last year, you have a challenge to some of our very fundamental notions of democracy and rule of law by a sitting president that ultimately results in a riot in our Capitol building. You have widespread protests because of repeated instances of police abuse against unarmed black men. You have a pandemic that we're responding to badly, and a polarized body politic. And I think what I was describing there is that there are some people who I think would make the assertion that the kinds of behavior we saw from Donald Trump, some of the right-wing movements that we've seen, all of this indicates that the myth of America as this great experiment in democracy and a melting pot and progress, that is just a myth. And so I'm describing in the preface a rebuttal to that says, yes, America typically has fallen short of its ideals, but the ideal of America as perhaps the only major power in human history, which is truly multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, that is premised on the idea of everybody having a voice and participating in making decisions, and that it is possible to come together as one people under a common creed, not based on blood and nationalism of a very narrow kind, but of a broader set of universal values. That idea still has power, and it still inspires me, but it is not something that we can take for granted, and we have to be able to look very clearly at where we fall short if we are going to ever try to achieve that ideal. And sometimes we do not look squarely at, for example, the legacy of race in our country. We're not honest about the work that needs to be done to overcome it.
Which answers my next question, because all the problems that you've been describing so eloquently a couple of seconds ago are in sharp contrast to the title of your book, A Promised Land. It seems that we're maybe farther away from the promised land than ever, or are we mistaken there?
Well, the phenomenon that we've been seeing in the United States, you've seen in Belgium, you're seeing across Europe, you've seen in a lot of countries, right? Which is, we've seen globalization create this enormous leap in wealth and information and sophistication of our industries and our companies and finance. But it has also produced in growing inequality, existential climate threat, and perhaps most important for our politics, a clash of cultures. And it's surfaced the fact that we still haven't figured out exactly how to live with each other when we're different. It's hard enough to live each other when we all look the same and go to the same churches or mosques or synagogues when we have the same customs. But now the world has shrunk, and we have to learn how do we live in a multi-culture, multi-ethnic society. And in that disruption, in that confusion, we've seen the rise of nationalism, populism, of a very dangerous sort. And we now have this contest of ideas. Can we preserve a liberal, tolerant, pluralistic society, or do we revert back to some of the old patterns of the past, which did so much damage? And I guess what I would argue would be that I think the promised land is still possible, but the reason I titled the book "The Promised Land," that's drawing from Old Testament biblical metaphors. Moses didn't get to the promised land, and there was 40 years of wandering in the desert before you got there. And I think we're in that wandering phase where we have to figure out how do we get there. And it may not happen in my lifetime. It certainly didn't happen during my presidency, but I still have faith that we can get there.
I want to come back to what you said earlier, the different cultures. We don't seem to understand each other anymore. And there you seem to wrestle in the book with the question, how much about the divide and the troubles is race, and how much is more genuine fear for globalization, about the loss of identity, the loss of cultural status, and how can politicians and presidents, of course, how can they respond to those grievances before it's too late?
Well, as I describe in the book, it's hard to disentangle motives sometimes of how people are feeling, especially when you're talking about large groups of people and mass psychology. I think what is fair to say is that all of us have inside us an instinct to be suspicious of things we don't know. And throughout human history, there have been tribal distinctions made between us and them. And that's sometimes been based on religion, sometimes based on race. In America, race has been the most powerful divider. In Northern Ireland, for example, religion would be the distinction. And what happens, I think, is that when people feel optimistic about their lives, then they are less vulnerable to appeals to fear and tribe and lashing out against those who are not like them. And when they are more insecure, they're more vulnerable to this kind of demagoguery. What that means then is, both in the United States, in Europe, our task is to create a greater sense of stability, a greater sense of economic certainty. We have to deal with some of the issues around those who've been left behind in this rapidly moving globalized economy. Oftentimes those are folks who feel as if their old status is slipping away from them. And if we can give them a better sense of hope, then I think they are less subject to appeals of race. It doesn't mean that racism goes away, but it does mean that it is modulated and managed in a way that I think then allows subsequent generations to drain away some of those old habits.
Well, but Lincoln couldn't do it. After the other presidents couldn't do it. We have 8 years of Obama, and then people vote for Trump.
Yeah, but keep in mind,
that,
I mean, the one thing that I think is very important to remember is that, history doesn't move in a straight line. And, it is true that Donald Trump, who seemed to have very different attitudes about these issues than I did, was elected. But he was elected by less than half of the United States, right? He won despite losing the popular vote because of the strange circumstances of our political system. When you look at surveys of attitudes among young people 35 and under, their attitudes about race are very different than their parents or their grandparents, much more open to people's differences and much less likely to believe that somehow somebody of a different race is lesser than them. And so what that indicates is that we're moving in the right direction. But there are certain features of the American political system that empower older voters, rural areas, those that are most likely to be afraid or feel as if their power is slipping away. One of the things I write about in the book, and foreign readers may not be aware of this, but the United States Senate, you get 2 senators from California. You also get 2 senators from Wyoming. Wyoming has 500,000 people. California has 33 million people. You both get 2 senators. So that part of the country that looks to the past rather than the future has a much bigger share of voting power in the Senate, and that's part of the reason why oftentimes our politics lags behind changing social attitudes.
I want to address another issue. The last part of your book is the most thrilling, if I may say. It's the killing of Osama bin Laden. Why did you write that as? Because normally you would expect you to write about the next election, your re-election, but you specifically chose that moment in time and you connected it with Trump, so to speak. It was a very strange moment. You were talking in a hilarious way, I must say, on the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and at the same time, your Navy SEALs were risking their lives.
Well,
can you elaborate on that?
I decided that was a good place to end the first volume of my memoirs because it indicated the parallel trends that were occurring during my presidency, or the dual reality that I had to deal with. On the one hand, the bin Laden operation was an example of the extraordinary capabilities that the U.S. government still has, and I try to describe in detail the intelligence officers and the Navy SEALs and all these people who make enormous sacrifices, operate at the highest levels of professionalism to achieve a very difficult task. And as I point out in the book, I ask myself, why is it that we display such single-minded focus and discipline and effectiveness on getting a terrorist, but we don't take issues like climate change or relieving poverty with the same kind of focus? But that's part of my reality. And then, on the other hand, Donald Trump represented the circus atmosphere of politics that also was occupying my time. And what I found as president is that partly because of social media and the rise of celebrity as a measure of worth in this new age, the circus so often threatens to overwhelm the actual work of government. And I think that, I wrestled greatly with how do I balance the need to attend to somebody like Donald Trump and the politics that he's created, while at the same time carrying out my responsibilities to actually do the work and effectively keep the American people safe and to deliver health care for them and do all the other things that we were trying to do. It's one of the dilemmas of modern politics is that it's not enough just to do the work. There's also the bread and circuses, as they say.
Yeah, and that tends to become a real problem. You write about it in the book very often, I must say, and it didn't become much better. Huh? We both agree on that. And you define it as maybe the challenge for democracy to survive. Social media, people just listen to what they want to hear and exclude everything else. How are we going to deal with that? Do you have ideas about that?
Yeah, I don't have a simple answer for this, but I think it's the biggest challenge to our democracies right now. You're a journalist, you're a storyteller, you understand the power of narrative, and part of what allows a democracy to function is that we may disagree on tax policy or trade policy or any number of issues, but we agree on a basic shared narrative about how do we resolve our differences, right? That we vote and we elect representatives and we put forward platforms and there's accountability and rule of law and a whole set of traditions and an independent judiciary and so forth. If we get to the point where we don't agree on the basic rules, if we don't agree on the basic facts, if we don't even agree that the planet's getting warmer because you have half the population who's been told that it's a hoax being perpetrated by liberal environmentalists, then you can't really function effectively as a democracy. And this problem of misinformation is one that we are going to have to solve. I think it's not going to be easy, but it's going to require a regulatory approach. It's going to require standards within social media that so far they have not been willing to adopt in terms of curating and monitoring what is distinguishing between truth and opinion, fact and opinion. I think it's going to be better education systems so that all of us are able to sort through all this flood of information that's now coming into at us. And all of this is probably going to take some time. So I worry in the interim what happens.
And it probably will take better politicians as well, because I remember at the beginning of your first term you said it's time to change the tone of our politics. That's 12 years ago. In hindsight, that sounds a little bit naive, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I don't mind being on the side of hope. Cynicism, I think, is a cheap kind of wisdom. I think that it is easy to despair. It's much harder to figure out, all right, we've got real problems. We have to look at them honestly. But how do we solve them? And, at the end of the day, I believe that the human family prefers peace over war, wants an economy in which everybody has opportunity. I believe that our old prejudices are deeply rooted, but not inevitable. and that we can do better. And so, what that means is sometimes you'll be disappointed, but every once in a while you'll be pleasantly surprised. And I think that, the fact that Donald Trump was a one-term president, the fact that my former vice president is now rejoining the Paris Accords and building on the healthcare reforms that we made and starting to move forward in a competent way in dealing with the pandemic. It reminds me, you're never going to get constant forward momentum. We don't in our own lives. I think all of us experience, times of progress and times of setback, times of great optimism and times of disappointment. But as long as we keep on going, then hopefully we get there.
Yeah, you write it beautifully in the book. You say, "I'm part of an unbroken chain of progress." That sums it up. Can I ask you a personal question, Mr. President?
Of course.
You write very personal things, by the way, in the book. I saw the possibility of practicing the values of my mother, what she taught me. How can you build power not by putting others down, but by lifting them up? Beautiful sentence. My question to you is, did you do that? Did you manage to do that? Did you lift people up by your own standards?
Yes. The one thing I can say without much hesitation is that I stayed true to my values during the course of my presidency. That I was the same person, maybe more gray hair, but the same person coming out as I was coming in. And look, as I write about in the book, there are times where those values would conflict, right? I describe the first time I ordered a military operation against a group of young Somali pirates that had hijacked a ship off the Horn of Africa, and how I would prefer to give those 18 and 19-year-old boys an education and opportunity, and instead they were killed in order for us to free a hostage they had taken. So there were times where I was conflicted, but both for me and the people who are around me, I think I can honestly say that at no point did I try to scapegoat other groups. At no point did I try to divide the country on purpose. At no point did I take a politically expedient position that would have sacrificed the well-being and the interests of some of my fellow citizens. So yes, I think whatever good we did, it was driven by the sentiment that my mother had asked me to think about.
Mr. President, I thank you very, very much for this interview. You still say to us, yes, we can. You still give hope. You still believe in what you're doing, and we all take lessons from that. Thank you so much, and good luck to you.
I very much hope I get a chance to visit Belgium again. Bye-bye.